and welcome to the next episode in our podcast on data sovereignty. I'm Wendy Shearer, Director of Partners and Ecosystems here at Pulsant. So I'm joined today by Steve Jewell, Nine23 Chief Executive. So before we jump into everything on data sovereignty, I thought it would be good just to spend a few minutes talking about yourselves, your careers, and the organisations that you work for.
I'm Steve Jewell. I'm the CEO at Nine23. Background is in defence, so started life in the MOD on submarine projects and then through a number of various technology companies to eventually be running Nine23. Nine23 is a high assurance managed service provider. What does that mean? We look after services infrastructure on private cloud, linking to hybrid capability, but in the high assurance space. So we focus on defence, law enforcement, national security type services, and so look after that kind of infrastructure to deliver capability across government networks.
So before we jump into data sovereignty in terms of what it is and how it applies to the industries, I'm keen to get your thoughts, Steve, on why do you think that data sovereignty has become effectively such a hot topic? Because managing secure infrastructure and environments has been happening forever, right? You've been doing that for a long time, but data sovereignty as a topic seems to have really popped up over the last kind of 12 to 18 months. So keen to get your thoughts on why that's happened.
Sure. I think before we answer data sovereignty, just to set the understanding of what we mean. So data residency being the postcode and data sovereignty being the laws that govern the access to that data. So many public cloud services are resident in terms of you can specify being in the UK, but that doesn't change the laws that govern access to that information. So that's what we're talking about when we mean sovereignty. We are heavily reliant on particularly US technology. Public cloud has been a big game changer to the UK and pretty much every country around the world. But that comes with a release of data sovereignty. The US Cloud Act has come into place, which effectively gives the US government the potential to access that information. So I think it's a question that as things change and the world becomes slightly more uncertain, we just need to sit and think about what data do we need access to? What data are we actually concerned about others having access to? Because in most cases, there is security, but there's sovereignty, and the two things are not the same. Data can be very secure, but somebody can legally have the right to access it. Is that important to you as an organisation, to the data that you're holding? They're the questions that really need to start to come to the fore. And I think the other element that links to all of that is just the rate of change of technology. There are so many advances happening so quickly that importance of how much data we actually have, what happens when you aggregate that data together. Sovereignty is becoming a key conversation thread to have whenever you're thinking about what information you're putting together from where.
So security, residency, sovereignty are kind of effectively the three component parts. And are you finding then in the industries that you work in that they are talking about that more, that it's become, it's right up there in terms of priorities?
I think policy's sort of behind a little. The conversations have started again in the last probably 12 months. Perhaps the term of sovereignty is back on everybody's plate in terms of, is this something that we need to consider? But it's still unclear as to what data and what information requires sovereignty. So certainly in the industries that we operate in, it becomes a discussion, and it's actually more about resilience than it is thinking about sovereignty in its own. Why does it need to be sovereign? Well, actually, in most cases, it's more about what happens if the services that I'm using to provide my operational capability are not available.
Yeah, so we had Asad Nouri from KPMG on in a previous episode, and he said very similar, actually, that this is really about creating data strategies that are fit for purpose, that are resilient, that are sovereign, and that they consider the different classifications of data, as you say, taking a step back and thinking, what does this particular type of data, like what are the requirements for it? Now, it's the data itself that is the really valuable asset. We talk about data being as more valuable than gold sort of thing. So But in those environments that you're talking about, everyone's working so hard to secure it, but the value comes from almost releasing it and using it and then being able to share it. And you talked there, Steve, about interoperability. So how on earth do organisations manage to move data from one place to another and still feel like confident that that can be done securely?
Great question with lots of threads in there. Yeah, as I say, I think you've got to separate security from sovereignty and resilience. In a public cloud, providers can deliver a very secure service. It's not actually about the security necessarily, but it becomes back to this point on interoperability, where it's not necessarily where the data resides. It's the fact that in order to use that and start to process it in a more meaningful way.
A phrase that I think you started, I'm sure it was you, Steve, secure supply web instead of supply chain. So can we talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think, as we've already touched on in various threads, that the complexity of not just IT services and solutions, but actually the delivery of capability that's both national, commercial, they're getting so complicated. There is so much more advancement in what you can do with technology and that drive for more and more data sets. All of that complexity is finding its way further and further away from the clients that are actually, or the end users that are operating the functions, the tools. It's the analogy of the car. If you go back 40 years, my parents would probably service their own car. These days, you open the bonnet, there's a plastic sheet over the top. Don't touch it. You've got to take it to the garage because no one really knows what's underneath. That's happening at a far faster pace and in far more depth across IT and technical solutions. So the digital services are very complicated. Therefore, there are more and more components being used by more and more organisations, and that traditional view of a supply chain that says, I'm organisation A and I buy this service from organisation B, so I'm going to make sure that they do everything in accordance with my standards, and I'm going to ask them who their subcontractor is. And it's a very sort of linear, we'll make sure that everyone in our supply chain meets the right standards so that we can be assured that the services we're delivering are appropriate. It's so much more complicated now that your subcontractor may have 18 subcontractors to themselves, some of which you use directly, some of which your other prime supplier might be using, and that interaction across multiple vendors and multiple products just continues to get complicated. So it's just a term to try and describe the complexity of it, rather than this linear thinking of, I know exactly what services I'm using and where it comes from.
That's why it blows my mind. So, Steve, we can't talk about data without talking about AI. It feels a little bit like last year reached, hopefully, the top of the hype cycle, and now it's about sort of practical applications. AI on one hand, secure data sovereignty on the other. How do those two things sort of layer on top of each other? Is there such a thing as sovereign AI?
So there are such a thing as sovereign AI capability in terms of concept and things that are now being built. They tend to be specifically government services that need to operate at the higher protective markings, where clearly using other people's platforms on which to process that data would not be a good idea. As you come down to the kind of middle tier, it's then more about, again, recognising what the information actually is sensitive. It's not necessarily the data set you pull from, and I think we need to recognise the fact that the AI processing generally is being provided by the large US tech giants. At the moment, capability in the UK to do something similar is to have on-prem air-gapped equivalents of those same technology stacks, but we're still reliant on those technology stacks. What's more important in terms of the conversation thread around sovereignty is the data is pulled from various locations, and that will be a mix of your own organisational data, data that's sat on private infrastructure, and data that's on public cloud. The data is the data, and it should be managed and protected as it was originally intended. But the point of AI and the ability for it to then generate decisions, outcomes, information and knowledge. What does that mean? And it's how important is the knowledge that's generated as a result of the processing. So it's again looking at what's the right data strategy, what's the right infrastructure platform, and back to networks and how you get data from A to B safely, so that you know what you have, where it is, and how it's being accessed.
And what I love about what you're saying there is actually the logic is the same. It's just substitute cloud for AI, for example. You know, it's just a platform, and we have to take the same things into consideration when we design solutions that include AI as we do with any other infrastructure. So same approach, just adding in another layer, if you like, in the option stack.
Yeah, I think it does things quicker. There's the point of using AI, but it still relies on data being provided to it for it to then generate a useful, meaningful outcome. I think from a data sovereignty point of view, as I say, it's more of the same, but just at a pace that humans without help can't keep up with.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is actually a rise in people talking about sort of private cloud AI, so thinking about the benefits that they get from AI, but building it in a private cloud environment so that they've got that assurance there. What would your advice be to someone who's not necessarily coming from a high assurance space, but can learn on the lessons that you've applied when you think about data sovereignty?
In a regulatory environment. So I was going to bring up the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill that had its second reading in Parliament last week and is due to come into force in late 26. That brings more regulation across the whole of the UK digital sector, similar to UK's GDPR. And it's a great place to start in terms of taking a look at some of the topics we've covered: sovereignty, security, more importantly, resilience. How are you ensuring that the services that you provide meet those requirements? Because it will become law. The Security Industry Association is going to be the regulator that controls that new policy. And over time, you can expect to see that people will be pulled up against those standards.
Yeah, because actually we focus so much on the security and trust in a technology space, and we forget to talk about the same principles and cultural element of that from partnership. Look, thank you so much. It was a fascinating conversation. We're delighted to have you as part of our ecosystem, so thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.